YouTube streaming. Yeah, it's working. Hello, everyone.
Hello, everyone. So we are beginning the December edition of our workshop. And as you know, we mostly are doing this text-focused workshop when we discussed some pre-uploaded text right away. But to entertain the public, we also invited some distinguished scholars to give lectures from time to time. And today we are doing it for the second time. So for the first time, it was Jeff's lecture. It was an autumn lecture. And today we are having December, we have a winter lecture. So we call them following seasons of the year. Pre-uploaded text right away. Yeah, there's some echo effect, I think. Yeah, but anyway, I'd like to say about before we start, because there might be some delay in people getting to us. I just wanted to briefly make a small announcement that we in our Center for Cultural Sociology here in Moscow, we have two positions opening. Postdoc position and tenure track assistant professor position, and please check. And you are the first audience to which we announce that publicly, and we have those announcements at our website. Please check on them. And today we are happy to have a lecture by Gabe Ignatow. Gabe works in North Texas University, and he graduated and got his PhD from Stanford University, and he authored a lot of interesting papers. And I must admit, I know him personally just from recently, but I know his works for a long time, and they always impressed me because he published very widely. He published in social theory, he published in history of sociology, he published in text mining and some empirical research. And he, of course, one of those who put a serious contribution in the so-called cognitive turn debate in the sociology of culture. And I think he's probably a unique figure in this respect, because as you might know, there is a very sensitive issue, this cognitive debate among cultural sociologists, among people like many of us who've been doing cultural analysis for many years without necessarily taking some knowledge from cognitive psychology and life sciences. But this is very energetic new movement, and I think it's very important. But I think the topic is very sensitive because it might mean, and in many cases, in cases of many authors, it actually means, or it is presupposed that good old cultural theories we've been dealing with for decades are becoming redundant because of this beautiful brand new knowledge from cognitive sciences, which we are not fond of that much. I mean, the very idea. And I think what is important about Gabe's work, beginning from his earlier works about Marcel Mauss, is that he's also, I think, pretty enthusiastic about this new type of knowledge, but he's also very careful about existing theories. And I think, in my view, he's doing it in not that revolutionary way. And I think he was one of the first, or probably the first one, who actually mentioned this deep parallel between the project of Marcel Mauss, which is very important for us because many of us are Durkheimians, and this new type of more holistic sociology, which might emerge out of these debates about the cognitive turn. So I think this parallel is very important and very promising. And although it's not yet clear in which direction it will take, I think these inquiries into cognitive psychology and even molecular biology, like Gabe did, might be very important for a future of the sociology of culture. So I think it's very promising debate, sensitive and ambiguous, but very important for us. So I'm happy to give the floor to Professor Ignatow.
Thank you, Dimitri. Thank you for the kind words of introduction. And thank you for setting this up and inviting me. And also thanks to Katerina and everyone involved at the Moscow Center. Dimitri and I have had a very rewarding conversation going on all of the topics you just mentioned, and I hope we'll continue in the Q&A on sociological dual process theory, cognitive sociology, trying to introduce ideas from the cognitive neuroscience realm into sociology without any kind of reductionism. And I think we'll continue that conversation later. He and I have discussed other topics as well. So thank you for inviting me. I'm honored by the invitation. I should note that I haven't given a lecture of this kind since I gave one at the New School in New York City when I was chosen as a replacement for Edward Tiryakian, the great Edward Tiryakian, because he was feeling sick. So I'm happy to be here as the first choice, not the second choice, but I'll take what I can get. I think I'll just want to say a few things about the work of the center, and I'll return to some comments on the work of the center at the end of my talk. I think the work of the Moscow Center is vital for the future of the social sciences. It is incumbent on us to produce long format, in my opinion, to produce long format intellectual social science content and to make it freely available on social media. We see this kind of high quality content from many other fields of inquiry. I mean, the volume of this content and it is exploding, and the quality I think is often quite high if you know where to look. And many of these voices are alternatives to the mainstream in all different areas of research, science, and letters. And I hope that sociology can be involved more than it has been. And it seems to me that the Moscow Center is in the avant-garde in this regard. So in my opinion, this kind of forum is needed for several reasons, but certainly to allow intellectual innovation to move from the periphery to the center of the social sciences. I think that's often how this kind of thing works. This is critically important if the social sciences are to renew their intellectual vitality as well as their public relevance. I don't think we will ever achieve the latter without the former. I mean, we have to do our jobs and come up with new ideas and work with people in other disciplines to maintain and reinvigorate the vitality of the social sciences. So I see this talk and the papers on which it is based as an exercise in social science of the future, maybe in the near term, maybe the long term. We need the social sciences to innovate, in my opinion, to move in new directions. And social science informed by the life sciences, but not in any way reduced to the life sciences, is one such direction that I find to be very exciting. And I don't think I'm the only person who feels that way. So in my talk, I'd like to introduce and contextualize a series of theoretical papers I published beginning in 2007. And I'm not going to go into great detail on the Microbiome-Gut-Brain paper because there is a ton of social science content in there, lots of new ideas that I'll sort of leave to the readers. I'll touch on them, but I just want to put that paper in context and explain why I think it's important and how it relates to the work of the center and to sociology writ large. So those papers started in 2007 with my Journal for the Theory of Social Behavior piece, Theories of Embodied Knowledge. There's also the 2012 article in the Journal of Classical Sociology. That's really a work of intellectual history, as Dimitri mentioned, on Marcel Mauss's lectures to psychologists, which are not much discussed by sociologists, but I think they're very important given the kind of discussions we're having in sociology about how we should relate to cognitive science and neuroscience. It turns out that discussion is nothing new. Marcel Mauss had lots to say about that, and I think he was right on most of his major points. There's also the two 2021 papers, the Microbiome-Gut-Brain paper in the Journal for the Theory of Social Behavior, and then one on cognitive sociology and relational biology in Sociological Forum that has been out for a couple of months. That's a special issue edited by Vanina Leshziner and Karen Cerullo. I recommend everyone check out that special issue. I think the quality is very high across the board. So from my point of view, looking back on 14 years of writing these kinds of papers, these 4 papers are closely tied together, and there are several threads that run through them. The main thread is an attempt to import major findings from neuroscience and life science generally into social science. And as Dimitri mentioned, to demonstrate the deep compatibility of the social and life sciences. I mentioned in the paper, and this is certainly how I see things, that and this is actually more prominent in the Sociological Forum article from this year, that the life scientists have sort of come over to our side in some ways. They are seeing things in a more sociological perspective than we might assume, and in a less reductionistic paradigm. And I think we should welcome the fact that they are, in some sense, on board with us in terms of looking at emergent properties and paying attention to epigenetics and things like that. So from my point of view, sociological theory has always been in the avant-garde in this respect, in terms of bringing in new ideas from other disciplines. I think the empirical side of the social sciences comes a little bit later to the party. The ideas come first, at least historically. And this began with Comte and the French functionalist tradition, which was so influenced by biology, and even with Anglo-American social Darwinism, which is obviously influenced by Darwinist biology. It is evident in those lectures Mauss delivered to an audience of psychologists. And it's even there if you read carefully in social constructionism, if you read Berger and Luckmann closely. And of course, today we have cognitive sociology, dual process theory, the sociology of the emotions, evolutionary sociology, and several related social science movements. That's not an exhaustive list. I would like to suggest today that there are better and worse ways of integrating the social sciences and the life science. And this may be, I don't know if controversial is the right word, but I'm trying to make an argument here, and we'll see how it goes. I think there's something like a low road and a high road. So different ways that we can interact with the life sciences. So as I see it, the low road is characterized by the following: by a pretty strict maintenance of disciplinary boundaries and disciplinary identities. So we are sociologists, we do it this way. The biologists, they do it that way. The psychologists, they do it that other way. I don't think that's the ideal way to innovate in any areas or to create new knowledge. Although disciplines they have an institutional importance, there's no question about that. There is the scholastic fallacy of kind of seeing the world and society through our theoretical lenses and assuming that everyone out there, ordinary people, think the way we do at some fundamental level. There are frequent debates over essentialisms and dualisms that are often directionless. They're directionless, in my opinion, in part because they're not grounded in empirical research. And when we ground our debates in empirical research, we can get past some of those essentialisms and dualisms. I mean, that language, that idea goes back at least to Bourdieu. That's exactly the kind of thing that he argued for and that he tried to accomplish in his career. You see occasional straw manning of alternative perspectives. So people looking to create straw men, straw people, in order to strengthen their arguments. There are zombie paradigms, kind of intellectual ghost ships supported by institutional power rather than scientific validity or their demonstrated explanatory power. And there are cyclical debates, as I see it, that occur over academic generations. So you have academic fashions where one generation forgets what happened 2 generations ago, and we just go on and on. And there are reasons why that happens, and I'll discuss those in a bit. In my opinion, there's also a high road, and this is characterized by questioning of disciplinary boundaries, or perhaps the view that disciplinary boundaries are there, they're useful, but they're a necessary evil. So it's not that we have to create one integrated science, but that the disciplinary boundaries are there as institutional structures to support our research, but we shouldn't take them too seriously. They're a means to an end. They shouldn't be the end in themselves. I think that's the high road way to do these things. Then there's the difficult work of developing bridging vocabularies between disciplines. So in my work, translating neuroscience or biology into existing sociological theoretical concepts. So I've attempted to do that in these 4 papers, and I'm not the only one. We can think of my friends and colleagues like Omar Lizardo or Steve Vasey, and many of the papers published in the Journal for the Theory of Social Behavior. And I think having a grounding in intellectual theory and the history of sociological theory and the history of sociology writ large is important here, because it turns out that many of the ideas that we might think are brand new and we might like to publicize as such, are not new. We have a rich theoretical history, theoretical vocabulary in sociology, and many of these ideas from other disciplines can be translated into our existing ideas. So we don't need to create new concepts, even though there are academic rewards, professional rewards for doing so. If people have already developed those concepts, let's look deeply into our own discipline and try to see, look for compatibilities if they exist. I think part of the high road is analytic holism, which is something, an argument I made in the Mouse paper, something that Mouse argued for quite extensively, the sort of whole person, whole man concept that that something is lost when we divide humans into their different constituent parts as we see it, the brain, the body, culture, society. They're all separate. They all require specialists to analyze each element, and the connections become secondary, but those connections are fundamental in my view if we see the whole person, see the person as something that is cultural and biological and social all at once, and economic and political too. I think that leads us to synthetic multi-level causal models that are inherently interdisciplinary, not sociological or psychological or economic, but the kinds of models that I point to in the MGB paper, and I'll talk about that in a bit. We ought to, as a matter of good academic manners or good best practices, steelman the alternative perspectives in our area, so try to find the strongest arguments for why we might be wrong rather than the weakest possible arguments. We should be ideally self-critical and find out why we're wrong before someone else does so. That's idealistic, but that's would be the ideal. And then I think if we do our jobs, we can abandon zombie paradigms, the kind of intellectual ghost ships that are no longer useful or have been surpassed, so that we can move on to more productive ways of doing social science. So I suggest that the low road is well traveled, at least in American sociology. This is certainly coming from an American perspective. And I think things might be a bit different in Europe, in Russia, because of different institutional structures in different parts of the world. But at least from a primarily American perspective, I think that this low road, this way of conducting interdisciplinary research is well traveled, in part due to the background of academic precarity and a kind of academic collectivism where people identify with their disciplines because there are academic rewards for doing so. And it is indeed precarious to be a polymath in any field of inquiry, at least in the American higher education system, and even in sociology, which is such an open field, and it's always been interdisciplinary, but everyone knows when you start your career in sociology, at least in the States, you better make contributions to sociology journals, and you better be doing proper sociology if you want a job in a sociology department. So, we all have to face that in our careers. There are publication incentives within research productivity regimes that have developed over decades. I mean, I was reading a quote the other day from C. Wright Mills. I mean, he faced exactly the same kind of research incentives that we face, where you have to publish several articles a year to move forward in sociology journals. So what's important is, from the point of view of any given academic, publication counts over the long-term impacts of those publications. And I think that obviously shapes the direction of research paradigms. And then just my own observation, and there's also a pretty extensive literature on this, the effect of hyper-partisan media on American popular culture. And I think it has suffused into academic discourse and from my point of view, degraded academic or intellectual discourse. And there's some excellent research on this topic I can point to. The way, we all consume so much partisan media, and it shapes how we think, maybe at some fundamental level. So let me give some examples, just from my own career, my own reading over the years, from psychology, where I see this as examples of the high road of interdisciplinary research, combining anthropology, biology, chemistry, biochemistry. So I look to the work of people like Robert Zions and Paul Rozin, people you may not know those names, or European social representation theory, and then plenty of research that's done in various non-glamorous subfields of psychology and related disciplines. There are plenty of people who do this kind of research. It's out there. It isn't always the most prominent research, but often these people are highly cited and influential. Nevertheless, examples of the low road, as I see it, include the old debate in psychology between Freudianism and behaviorism. This is kind of exaggerated debate these extreme poles. Then there was the 1970s movement of sociobiology in that kind of E.O. Wilson mode, kind of colonizing mode that, we don't need social science. Social science isn't real science. We need to do, genetics gives us everything we need. And if we understand people's genes, we can understand all we need to know about their behavior, more or less. And you can't study culture anyway, because it's, anyway, it's too difficult to study. So we can reduce the social sciences to the life sciences. That's not the right way to do interdisciplinary research at any level. And of course, there's moral rationalism versus moral intuitionism. That's a debate in psychology, in moral psychology, between Lawrence Kohlberg and Jonathan Haidt and other people. And it also exists through people like Steve Vasey. It sort of entered into sociology too. But everyone knows, our undergraduates know, that the truth is always somewhere between these extremes, between these poles. So why do we debate in terms of these extremes? I'm not sure. I don't think it's the right way to do things. Examples of the high road for me from sociology include, obviously, from my publications, the work of Marcel Mauss, of Berger and Luckmann, of Bourdieu and Bourdieusian sociology. And there's plenty of other research that I think integrates ideas from other fields, including the life sciences and cognitive science, into sociology. Of course, Omar Lizardo has that article on Piaget and Bourdieu, and you see the influence there. Examples of the low road from sociology, in my opinion, include some of the kind of sociologies of. So every time sociology encounters any other field of inquiry or any new kind of hot area, we create a sociology of it, and then we kind of sociologize it, and we incorporate it using our old theories and make it into a compartment and maybe a section of the American Sociological Association. We institutionalize it in a way that makes it very safe for us, but it's not genuinely interdisciplinary. So I think, an example would be the sociology of the body, when that sociology is totally divorced from the life sciences. So there are plenty of people who do the sociology of the body, or at least they have. I don't know if it's still a cutting edge research area. I think it's still alive, but without any reference to biology, or hardly any, or certainly not a deep engagement with the life sciences. And that seems like a lost opportunity, in my opinion. And then I think to some degree, sociological dual process theory falls into this trap. And Dimitri has an article from last year on this. I think he's exactly right. We'll talk about sociological dual process theory a little bit later, but I think that there are some issues with it, as Dimitri mentioned in the article. I might also just step aside or step out of my sociological compartment here and mention the work of my favorite novelist of the 20th century, and I'm going to mispronounce his last name, but it's Vladimir Nabokov, the great Russian-American novelist. And he was, a great fiction writer, and at the same time, a renowned lepidopterist, a scientist of butterflies, and a really leading edge butterfly scientist. And so it seems to me, and maybe apropos of this talk, that if he can be the greatest novelist of the 20th century, or one of them, and a world-class life scientist, a world-class butterfly researcher, perhaps it's not too much to ask a few sociologists to take an interest in the life sciences as well. He managed to integrate these two areas, or to do research at the highest level in both. So it's possible. I find him quite inspiring. In any case, sociologists should, in my opinion, whenever possible, take the high road. I think that the contemporary internet-enabled accessibility of life sciences research today, we're living in some ways just a fantastic world where we can study everything we want in the life sciences from our phone. We can get all this information. It's all there for us. There really isn't an excuse for not exploring different forms of knowledge, different sciences, different research areas. And we can all take the high road. We can all engage with these different fields and incorporate different ideas from other fields into our research. And then there's also part of the context in which we work today is this kind of freewheeling nature of intellectual debate on the internet. And if sociology is going to be part of that debate, it's vital for us to make the social sciences more interdisciplinary and more freewheeling, so that we can make academic social science relevant to these discussions. Insofar as we are inward facing and allow zombie paradigms to persist for decades, we are not doing our jobs, and we will continue to fade from public relevance. So let's hope the Center for Cultural Sociology will become a leading light for some kind of highbrow interdisciplinary social science. I think that's exactly what is happening at the center. It seems to me that the center has an opportunity and maybe a duty to do so. So those are my introductory remarks. Let me talk a little bit about the 2021 Journal for the Theory of Social Behavior article that was shared with the participants. So the main points of this, as I see it, are the following. First is the compatibility of genomic life science with social science. So this may be slightly overstated. I know that, I'm generalizing about the life sciences, but I'm doing it from, reading the, high impact factor, highly influential, high quality life science research. But it's very clear to me that we in sociology, I think, still have this idea of the life sciences as being working within a paradigm of genetic determinism, where they study genes and genes express themselves in our phenotypes, and it is a reductionist point of view. And it seems to me that since the failure of, it's very clear in any case, and much has been written on this, since the failure of the Human Genome Project in 2003, and the rise of epigenetics as a dominant paradigm within the life sciences, that there is not a deep incompatibility between social science and life science. If epigenetics, that paradigm is correct, and it clearly is, it clearly seems to be the case, and social environments and cultural environments shape, they turn on and turn off our genes, and those genes are then reproduced in the next generation, then we need to know what is happening in social environments. Social environments cannot be reduced to genes. The direction is the causal arrows go in both directions. So we're operating in that kind of context, and it seems to me that's there's so much potential for interdisciplinary research in that context. And maybe something we can return to in the Q&A. So let me just give an overview of the microbiome-gut-brain, and this is the bulk of the paper, and I'm not going to go through the details because there is a ton of detail in there. People are free to kind of delve in as deep as they want to and use it as they want to, but I see it as an electrochemical kind of plumbing system that is in all of us. And if we can understand the main contours and some of the main elements of that plumbing system, we don't have to become biologists, but if we know some of the basics, that can help us understand how culture and the body interact. So some of those elements include the enteric nervous system. So the fact that our guts have essentially brain cells, trillions of or many billions of brain cells in them, and that they are connected to our central nervous system. The gut is in fact part of the central nervous system. There's no separation. So in that sense, if we think that cognitive sociology, for example, or cognitive science is the science of the brain, and cognitive sociology is the science of the brain applied to society or interacting with the study of society, that in itself is a mistake, because you can't cut off the brain at the neck. The brain is attached to the vagus nerve and through it to our gut. And so the whole microbiome gut system, it's inseparable. These elements are inseparable. They have to be understood together. You can't cut off the plumbing at any given point. So I think there's a pretty radical implication there, clearly for cognitive science, but also by extension for cognitive social science. Maybe we shouldn't even be talking about cognitive social science. So the enteric nervous system is absolutely central to the argument in this paper. There's also the blood-brain barrier, where our brains interact with the rest of our body, and it's a kind of filter system, and all of the kind of chemical compounds involved in the rest of our body and our gut and microbiome go through into our brain. Some of them do and some of them don't. Those compounds include hormones, neurotransmitters, and then catecholamines and serotonin and oxytocin and bile acids. And I only mention all of this biochemistry because I would like sociologists to at least be alerted to the sociological relevance of these biochemistry categories. Like, these things are important for social behavior. And we do know something about the causal mechanisms by which these different chemical compounds are involved in social behavior and in cultural behavior. So again, we're not going to, I'm not going to give a lecture on organic chemistry, but I think we should all be sensitized to the sociological relevance all of this, and we shouldn't turn away when we see this kind of science. So in the paper, I suggest that there is a pretty obvious sociological relevance of microbiome-gut-brain neuroendocrinology and also of nutritional psychiatry, two sciences that I assume most social scientists have never heard of, but these are fast developing sciences, and I think the research coming from them is very exciting and relevant for social science. So in the paper, I go through some of the relevance of papers published in these areas, studies published in these areas that were not intended to have social scientists as audiences. But if you read them, I mean, the sociological relevance is obvious, it's patent, they're saying things that sociologists should know about, in my opinion. So I think that all of this has substantive or has implications, obvious implications and relevance for substantive research on crime, on social and political attitudes, and on social capital, and specifically social capital formation, friendship formation. So in the paper, I go through some of the research on hypocholesterolemia, very low cholesterol levels, and violent crime, and some of the studies that have come out for well over a decade on the blood tests conducted on violent criminals, often post-mortem, who tend to have very low levels of, extremely low levels of serum cholesterol. And so why is that? And is there a relationship there? And if you are a criminologist or a sociologist of crime, that seems to be something that you'd want to know about. If there is this fundamental biological, neurological difference, nutritional difference between violent criminals and other people, that's something that we would want to theorize and not just set aside. Same goes for the relationship, the demonstrated relationship between oxytocin and stress, social bonding, and learning. So in psychiatry and so in nutritional psychiatry and psychology, these relationships have been demonstrated. The relationship between oxytocin, this kind of like warm and fuzzy chemical compound that makes us intuit other people's feelings. It's associated with social bonding and empathy. It's basically the empathy, to simplify grossly, it's a kind of empathy hormone. And I would think that we'd want to know, if we're interested, sociologists are interested in stress, if we're interested in social capital formation, social bonding, life satisfaction, and then also learning, we should know something about oxytocin, or at least we shouldn't be fearful of learning about oxytocin. How do we do this? Well, it's already being done, this kind of research. It's not necessarily being done within the field of sociology for various reasons, but people in nutrition, nutritional research are using nutritional surveys, for example. And this research is, I believe, entirely European. Much of it is French, but there is a large research program on ultra-processed food consumption, the consumption of UPFs, which in an American context is food. Like that's what people eat here. And it's of some concern, I think. So it seems to me it's research malpractice for American sociologists and criminologists not to study possible causal relationships between the American ultra-processed food diet and then the observed high rates of crime and violence in this country. I mean, is it just a correlation, or is there something going on there at a neurochemical level? And also the relationship between ultra-processed food consumption and depression and anxiety disorders in the United States. And in the world, but it's especially acute in the United States. In this area, social science research that is interdisciplinary, realist, and holistic, that involves the whole person, kind of analytic holism, it seems to me is a necessity rather than a luxury. So you can't study these things if you only want to look at psychology, or only sociology if you define sociology only in terms of social relationships divorced from biology. At the same time, you shouldn't only study the biology of these things, because the sociological element is obvious. So it seems to me that we need some kind of MGB, Maussian, Bourdieusian, whatever framework, an interdisciplinary, realist, holistic framework to study relationships between diet and crime and social behavior and friendship formation and learning, everything that sociologists care about. So I won't go into more detail there, but we can certainly discuss it in the Q&A. For sociological theory, I would argue that, to me, the habitus more or less is the microbiome-gut-brain. It seems to me that this is exactly what Bourdieu was talking about when he theorized habitus. I mean, he even used language of, sort of a taste for the necessary and a feel for the game. And the habitus is this kind of element of us that adapts to new social situations gradually, generally below consciousness. It takes time. And of course, there are mismatches between our habitus, as we move into new social, new institutions, new organizations, new social contexts. And it seems to me that's exactly what the gut is, what the MGB is. If any one of us were to move to the Arctic Circle and live with the Inuit and eat whale blubber, it would take some getting used to, but we could probably do it. We would learn, our guts would eventually adapt, and our habitus would adapt, right? Our whole lifestyle would adapt, and it would take time. And it's the same, seems to me it's the same fundamental processes that occur when, a student from a working class background gets a scholarship to a private college or a private high school and has to adapt. And it's the kind of topic that Bourdieu studied in great detail in his studies of education. And that's what, to some degree, Bourdieusian sociology is about. So it seems to me, the MGB is the habitus, more or less, and the habitus is the MGB. Okay, and then yes, if we're going to do MGB type research, it's again going to feature holism, realism, because we're studying something that is there. It's absolutely real, and we can discuss that if we want to discuss philosophy of social science and epistemology. And it's necessarily interdisciplinary. I don't think there's any way around it. Okay, so let me turn to Professor Alexander's talk from late September at the Moscow Center. I want to end with some concluding thoughts on applying an MGB, microbiome-gut-brain perspective on Professor Alexander's cultural sociology of wilderness, on a brilliant talk and a terrific topic on the cultural construction of nature romanticism and how, the nature romanticism, the romanticist artists, novelists and poets shaped the Western imagination regarding nature, that made nature into something sacred and magical and transcendent rather than just a resource to be plundered for our own self-interest, our own instrumental value or instrumental use. So what can an MGB, kind of Maussian, Bourdieusian perspective add to this cultural constructionist argument, strong cultural constructionist argument? So I would bring to your attention the Japanese tradition of Shinrin-yoku, of forest bathing. So this is a longstanding, for all I know, thousands of years old tradition of going into the woods and experiencing forest bathing and experiencing a kind of the health benefits of just walking through the woods and breathing in whatever it is in the woods that some magical chemical compounds to make us feel good when we go into the woods. And this is something that Japanese people, it's part of Japanese culture, and they do regularly, and they think that it has great health benefits. And it turns out they're right. So there is a research literature on the physiological effects of Shinrin-yoku, that people who go out in the woods for a number of hours experience lower blood pressure and lower blood glucose levels if they're diabetic. Some of the mechanisms here are, have been spelled out. There are compounds that are released by trees and other plants that we inhale, and that they affect our biome, and they have positive health effects on us. So, where does that leave us? Well, we have this a cultural constructionist argument. We have also this kind of biological element to the experience of nature. I think if we take an MGB perspective seriously, we can apply the principles of analytic holism, interdisciplinarity, and cultural realism. And then we can ask, okay, how do cultural beliefs affect Shinrin-yoku? How does the experience of art, this aesthetic experience, what is the biology of this aesthetic experience? Does it change the way, do our ideas change how we interpret nature and how we experience nature at a biological, physiological level? So do nature romanticist novels and films affect how we experience nature, both subjectively and physiologically. I think it would be valuable to know this. And there's precedent for this kind of research. So there is research on the physiology of religious experience. And if I would look carefully, I could probably find research on the physiology of aesthetic experience too. But I think those are exactly the kinds of interdisciplinary research projects that we should at least engage with in sociology, because they operate at multiple levels and they're both biological and sociological in nature. I mean, I would like to know more about the biology of aesthetic experience. And I think that would be very useful. And we could perhaps isolate the effects of culture on our physiology. So I'll end with the thought that cultural sociology is well established thanks to the efforts of Professor Alexander and the Center and Phil Smith and so many others. And we all benefit from having an institutional home within sociology that is welcoming to cultural research. But maybe we can take this research to another level and reach out to the life sciences. Who knows? We might find some lovely butterflies of our own. And with that, I'll say thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I think we can go to questions and answers session now, and comments, everything.
I just wanted to say hi to everyone because I've been teaching during our normal meeting time, so I haven't gotten to come yet. But thank you for inviting me, and I've really missed it. I guess I have one question just about, like, I agree with everything that you say, but then when I start to envision the details, I'm wondering if you could talk more. I think one would be about methods. So like, what kinds of methodological tools are we going to have to develop? Well, we have to start working with like microeconomists as well as, geneticists in order to start, unpacking causality kind of things, or building like more and more like huge teams that have enormous grants that are able to like identify these processes. And then I guess like my other question was more about like, not that I have an opinion about this, but is this a slippery slope into biological determinism, in the sense that what if it turns out, I don't really know the right language to say all these things, but what if it turns out that genes themselves also shape whether the gene and culture interact in different ways? And then how do you deal with that? I know that's embarrassing, but that's my general question.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think in terms of methods, I think the methods are already there. So, I mean, there's this research team in North Carolina where they do, and there are several research teams where they do kind of genetic sociology. It's actually in maybe a more reductionist mode that I would prefer, but people are doing that research with big data. They have a team of sociologists and all kind of big data people and people and geneticists. And so that research is occurring. One of my colleagues, Tianji Kai, he works in Macau now, but he was part of that. So in terms of looking at gene environment interactions, sociologists are already involved in that kind of research. It's not my area of expertise, but that's already occurring. Then, I mentioned this in the paper. There are nutritional surveys. I think nutrition is one of the easy entry points, or the easier entry points to this. If you want to know what's going on in the microbiome-gut-brain axis, one entry point into it is nutrition, what people eat. Not only what people eat, but also like the sunlight and the relationships as sort of part of nutrition too. But there's research in nutrition science where they give surveys and they find out, about, for example, ultra-processed food consumption. So those surveys have been developed over at least a decade, I think 10 to 15 years, and they're freely available. We can use them. We can get that data, and there are demonstrated relationships between ultra-processed food consumption and various outcomes that are of interest to sociologists. So we don't have. We can modify those survey items and those surveys, and if we want to, or create them from whole cloth, but the instruments are already there, and there are sociologists who are are able to get, it's kind of serum data from blood draws and things like that. And that's a little bit more exotic and more difficult from a, kind of ethics perspective. But there are tools out there, and we could probably think of some on our own. But I don't think we need to do. I mean, the tools are available if we want to go down that road, and I think people already are within sociology, and then definitely outside sociology. And then the second part, is it a slippery slope to reduction, kind of reductionist, reduction of the social sciences into the life sciences, or of everything down to the gene? And I think, I mentioned this, I think this is clear in the Sociological Forum article, where, there was a lot of, as I understand it, as I've read, there was a lot of soul searching among life scientists after the failure of the $3 billion, I think that it was more than that, the most costly scientific project ever, which was the Human Genome Project, which you probably heard about 20 years ago, and then you stopped hearing about it because it didn't work. They completely mapped the human genome, and the idea was that once you map the human genome, we would all be able to determine human diseases. We'd have a full understanding of the etiology of human disease, and we could solve, come up with sort of personalized cures, genetic, sort of customized cures for every disease, because we would know all the mechanisms that lead to disease, because disease is a result of genetic propensities for disease. And it failed. It was really an utter failure. They learned very little that was useful. I'm sure they learned a few things inevitably, but it was that opened up the field of epigenetics, that fundamentally our genes are turned on and off by experience, by social experience, by experience in the environment. And that's been demonstrated, and that's been the direction, as I understand it, of the life sciences, beginning even before 2003, but certainly since the admitted failure of the Human Genome Project. So, and this has been written about. I think Steve Vasey has an article where he discusses epigenetics, and there's some other. I have some citations in both articles of a few sociologists who do discuss epigenetics, and so there's a debate on this, and some recognition that we probably don't have to worry about genetic reductionism anymore. Maybe some people are still hung up on that. I think that's in the rearview mirror. I hope so. Maybe that's optimistic. But thanks for the question, Jason.
Thank you. Jason? Yeah.
Hi, thanks. Thanks, Gabe. This is a really interesting project. It's more than this trajectory. And I'm impressed with your knowledge of this, which was honestly kind of intimidating, because it's daunting to think that I would need to gain, add another discipline to my repertoire to be able to engage in this type of, conversation. But so my question comes from, I'm wondering where you think, as this project develops and maybe more people get involved in it, what level of analysis do you see, more empirically oriented studies? Where would they be aiming? And so I guess, where would the level of, in terms of sociological processes, where would levels of sort of explanation be taking place? I'm thinking about Marcel Solons responded to E.O. Wilson's work by saying, he was pointing out that there was this topic about some of the talk was about are we sort of predisposed toward certain types of aggression or not? And Solons was saying that the soldier in the foxhole is not is not being driven by either some sort of either psychological or biological impulses. They're thinking about their family. They're probably scared, but no matter what, they're going to be told what to do by structures and forces greater than themselves. So we could say, okay, well, do we need to look at the decision makers sort of, neurobiological processes, or, are there sort of extra individual social processes that are shaping the biological? Is that the idea? That is there a reciprocal relationship between the MGB system and the social context? And so if I come back to the more contemporary moment, I was thinking of like, there's a good amount of talk about nutritional dead zones in certain, the geography, the social geography and the physical geography of cities. And so there's a relationship between inequality and, economic distributions of resources that produce, nutritional dead zones in certain parts of the city. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, do you see your work, would you be looking at how the MGB would influence decision-making about sort of economic interest that then would have an impact on the urban, the distribution of nutritional, opportunities across the city? Or would the, I hope I'm getting these letters right, the MGB, would you be using this more in terms of like, look, these are sort of like macro sociological processes that impact on the development of a city and how there are distributions of nutritional opportunities across, unequally distributed across it. And then you would use this work to show like, this is where the impacts are. It not only, you might be saying like, well, in high crime areas, part of that would be that because of these unequal distributions, you're gonna have these impacts on bodies. So it would be like a supplement to, so I guess what I'm trying to say is like, do you see it as more like macro sociological explanations or sort of like that micro international? I mean, I know that we're not supposed to make these divisions, but so you would be talking about like people who are sort of, because of where they're born into in an urban landscape, they're gonna be more impacted internally, and then that might shape their, their interactional dispositions. But then would you be then sacrificing the capacity to talk about the more macro structural forces or dynamics? Okay, sorry, I hope that made sense. Thanks.
No, I don't think I'm proposing any real radical change in terms of levels of analysis when we talk about sociological research on, let's say, social problems. I mean, I see the MGB as, the accusation leveled against the habitus was that it was a black box. No one knew what was going on inside it. Some things go in and then some things come out. There's some outputs and inputs. And this is just like unpacking that. Like, well, the black box is this electrochemical system. It is the MGB. What goes in is all kinds of things, right? But nutrition is part of it. And from the macro environment into the black box, into the MGB, into the person, the whole person. And then you have outputs, you have behavior, you have crime, you have learning, educational attainment, things like that. So this is, I think it's a refinement or an advancement of the kind of psychological, like neuroscience, cognitive science presuppositions of macro sociology. It's like, okay, we think that, you wouldn't necessarily even know to look for a relationship between nutritional dead zones and crime if you don't have a theory of what's going on in the person, in the black box, in the habit, like that there would be relationships between the two. Or you might assume that there are some, or you might use some other models. But this helps us as a kind of almost an intervening variable, but it would help us to do macro sociology better because it would help us to know what inputs to look for and and to have a theory that would relate inputs to outputs, and to make the black box something that is is open to inquiry. But I don't think it changes anything fundamental. I mean, you still have multi-level kind of emergent processes, sociological processes that are not reducible in any way to biology. And in fact, it's what everything from epigenetics tells us is quite the opposite. That living in this is the frightening part of epigenetics research, that living in a nutritional dead zone can have multi-generational effects because it affects the genome. So I see it as I don't think it more knowledge of human biology, neuroscience, the enteric nervous system, and all of this. I don't think it fundamentally changes macro sociology, but it allows for a kind of refinement, and it points to causal relationships that wouldn't be intuitive or that aren't provided by our current theories that are less interdisciplinary, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's persuasive. But I guess like the theoretical ambitions, it seems to me like in the when the neurocognitive literature is worked through Bourdieu's theory of reproduction through the habitus, it seems like to me like the theoretical ambitions are quite significant. And I'm wondering if you feel similarly in this work, which is that in my reading of that literature, of the cognitive cultural work, is that that the social relations get internalized, and that shapes the cognitive and neurological schemas. And then through people's lived experience, they reproduce the structure, right? The structuring structure. Would we suggest that this is happening in the biological sense as well? I mean, so if some people are arguing that that's what's happening in the brain, would we then be arguing, well, that's what's happening in the the other nervous system?
Well,
yeah,
it is.
That the idea?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, because there's no separation. I mean, it fits, in my opinion, exactly with Bourdieu. That, I mean, if you grow up in a working class family, you get a taste for, the food that you're presented. You want beer, not wine. You don't develop a taste for art and music and literature. You develop a taste for whatever, comic books and video games or whatever it may be. And that's all the way through. It's not just in the brain. It's not some categories that are easily manipulated or changed. I mean, it's in the gut itself. I mean, if you grow up eating, highly processed foods, that's what you're used to. So even if you're put in a better environment, it would take time to adapt, because that's what, you're going to go run to, Kentucky Fried Chicken because that's what you want. And you wouldn't know, you wouldn't be comfortable, for example, eating at a, organic food or something like that, because that's not what you have learned to like. It would take time to adjust, as it takes time to change your accent if you go, change schools or you change neighborhoods. So this just sort of specifies, what those structures are, and takes them out of just the brain. I mean, not just the brain, but out of the brain, I mean, into the whole body, and shows this is exactly how it works in the body. They're not just like, this is in the Sociological Forum article a little bit. I mean, you see this in cognitive sociology, where it's like there's some imagery, a kind of optical imagery about, like lenses and frames and things like that, as though we have this machinery in our brains that can shift pretty quickly to change how we interpret the world and how we relate with the world. And I think what you get from the MGB, all this literature, all this biology, is that changes much more slowly, because it's all the way through us. It's in our guts, our gut, our brain. Our whole microbiome becomes attuned to our environment. And, then it gives a kind of biology of hysteresis where, okay, if you move to a different environment, it is going to be very difficult, not impossible, but it's going to take time for you to adapt. And you're probably going to have this kind of gravitational pull back to your, so your position in the field of, of origin, where you came from, because it feels right. It doesn't feel right to be in this new environment. So I think it just specifies what we already have in Bourdieu and what we already have in sociology to some degree. And it just points to some specific empirical relationships that we might want to investigate if we don't want to just do sociology as we knew it, but we want to really explain, like, okay, crime or whatever the topic is, or poor learning outcomes, or what have you. I think it's a mistake to try to explain those phenomena without reference to some of these internal. I mean, you can do it, but there's a benefit to there's explanatory value to including some recognition of what goes on, in the human, in the person, that makes these processes work. All those connections. So I don't. Yeah, I'm no E.O. Wilson. I'm not trying to colonize anyone. I just think it's a little more detail, a little more knowledge, and integration of research from other fields just allows us to do sociology better, and maybe to do it in a little bit more interdisciplinary way if we want to. And if we don't do it, other people are doing it anyway. So I think we should get on board, because we have a lot to offer, and I don't think the life sciences are dead set against us, maybe the way they were. I mean, they might be, but some people might be, but the way they were, at least conceptually, 20 years ago.
That's interesting. I mean, I would want to come back to yeah, this relationship between social organization and the internalization of it. You know, this whole sort of the theory of the habitus, how it is structured, and then how it contributes back to structuring the social. But I'm going to, so I think that's really an interesting topic, and it sounds like obviously the connection between these two nervous systems gives you a really powerful, you know, logic to saying why we should be paying attention to this other one as well. So, but I want to just leave it there. And yeah, thank you for the work and for your reply.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. I could talk about the habitus for hours. I've lectured on it about 100 times at my university. Students get it though, like they, and we have a lot of like working class, kind of lower middle class students, and they come to college and they get, you know, hysteresis, and they get how hard it is to adapt. So it's something I do like to talk about, but thanks for the question.
Cool. Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And we have a question from the room.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for this brilliant speech. And before I ask my question and make my comment, I'd like to follow up a little bit on your exchange with Jason about this class and food issue, because what came to my mind immediately is that Bourdieu was criticized because of in his writing about taste and social origins of taste and the ability of taste to produce the reproduction of class structure. He was criticized, criticized by the based on that it's probably true for parents of his days, or probably even for certain circles in there, and probably it's probably not that much true for some other places. And what immediately came to my mind in terms of nutrition and health and really class reproduction in the United States, where how much money you can afford to spend on your food actually makes a lot of difference in terms of health, in terms of obesity. So you can visually, this class structure at some point becomes probably even visual. But if we address to some other places and other cuisines, for example, Mediterranean cuisine, it's probably not that much class distinguishing, and it could be different there, and so it's probably not universal. But most importantly, I'd like to make this comment and question and turn it then into the question, because I think the great success of your paper is that actually the criticism of this cognitive sociology or cognitive science as a science about the brain. I think this is a very important point, and it is even more important because what is happening, and I tried to show it in my paper you mentioned earlier, that even when cognitive sociologists are trying to say that we know that it's not only about the brain, what they then actually do, it leads us to understand that culture resides in the brain, and then we go immediately to computational model of cognition. And even when people say that, okay, culture not exclusively resides in the brain, when what they do is they say that, okay, it resides in the brain, it can reside somewhere else, but then we must learn how it actually is getting from out there to the brain and becomes really culture, right? So it's kind of, I think it's this model, NGB model, is very important in very deep understanding what is deeply wrong about this idea that culture and meanings reside exclusively in the brain. So I think this is a success, the success of the paper. This, so to say, negative thesis is a success, and if it wouldn't contain anything other than that, it would be still very successful research. But I'm trying to move forward and to understand, and this is going to be my question, how much further we can move based on this MGB thing. Because for example, what you're saying about the post-genomic thing is also very important, and I immediately recall this. I once talked with Julia Kovas, who is head of British twin longitudinal study. So they study twins, and because of that, we are trying to find how far genes actually affect our behavior and how far social factors. And some of these issues are complicated for me because I'm not a biologist and never trained as a biologist. But basically, they say that it's kind of 50-50. So 50% is in our behavior is based on genes, and 50% by social milieu, and those two are interacting. Actually, it's not just 50 plus 50, and those two are interacting. But actually, what I cannot understand from that, and probably I'm not, I just didn't, read enough, is that how exactly can we actually go further and see how exactly these social factors and genetic factors come to interaction. So how exactly social factors and social and culture turn, as you wrote, turn the genes on and turn the genes off. So can we actually, if not, I mean, we probably cannot go further at this point, and it's only hope to go further. But if we can, so how far can we go further? Because and to put it just a little bit differently, do you think MGB is a metaphor of how we should, see culture and cognition, or is it more like a concrete model with which we can learn a little bit more of what is actually happening when genes interfere, or microelements or human biology actually get in contact and into interaction with social and cultural factors? So is it just a metaphor and a general idea that we should, build more ecological-like, sociology, more see a human being as a complicated ecosystem where culture and biological factors are, coexist, but at this point we cannot move forward, or this MGB model actually gives us, opportunity to make some concrete steps. So that is the question.
Yeah, let me start with the Bourdieu comment you made. I mean, I would just mention there's some research by my old classmate Stephanie Malborn. It's in, I think, a paradigm in the sociology of health and illness that's known as health lifestyle theory. So it's very influenced by Bourdieu. And they basically show that, among United States kind of bourgeois parents, good health practices, nutritional practices, good practices are a form of cultural capital that they pass on to their children. It's a status marker, and they teach their children how to eat and what to eat and so on. And so I totally get the critique of Bourdieu that he was too rooted in Paris, that this is a kind of, like no one cares, whether you know about wine or escargot or whatever, but it doesn't matter to me at all. I think that we have different consumption patterns, at least in the United States, but they're completely classed, and they're completely taught and passed generation to generation as class practices, and they're very exclusive, right? I mean, the farm to table and organic and all of that, and it's that research is being done, and with survey research and ethnographic research, and people definitely in the United States and in many other countries. There's such a large literature on all consumption practices, including nutritional practices. So yeah, he was rooted in Paris, but it doesn't matter to me. It's still relevant. Is the MGB a metaphor? I mean, it is a metaphor. I think it's a useful metaphor for thinking about the habitus. And it just provides more detail, but I don't think it's only a metaphor. I think that these are the actual electromechanical processes by which we learn, by which we adapt to new situations. And, so I guess there's this question, is it, 50-50 genes, environment? I mean, I think that depends 100% on the outcome of interest. So if the outcome is your eye color, it's 100% genetic. If the outcome is, do you receive a PhD in sociology? I would say it's mostly environment, because I don't think anyone is born, I mean, maybe, but you may have a genetic propensity for that, but I don't think it's very predictive. So I think it completely, or your taste in art, I mean, that's not going to be determined by your genes. So, but it doesn't even, I guess for me, I mean, in the paper, I start with genetic determinism and just move on to epigenetics. I guess because I don't care, because 50%, if everything were 50% determined by society and culture, that would be plenty. Like, that would be plenty for sociologists to work with. And I think it's much higher than that for most outcomes. But it doesn't, I mean, there are people who who are interested in those questions. But I mean, for me, genes are just part of the mechanism of reproducing society, generation to generation. And exactly what part of the mechanism they are in for any given outcome and how they work, to me, it's less interesting than if we know something about those mechanisms, we are better positioned to analyze social problems and social phenomena that we want to analyze as sociologists. That's our job to do. So I guess, yeah, for me, I mean, I guess I just focus less on genes. It's clear that genes do not determine behavior. Now, almost no one claims that anymore. So, and the people who claim that, I think, were taking the low road in the sense of being self-promoting. Like, this is how you, I mean, Durkheim did that for sociology with suicide. I mean, this is how you establish a field. You make some slightly exaggerated claims for your area, and then you build out institutionally from there. And then later in the next generation, Mauss just, a few years later said, well, we know, in his lectures to psychologists, well, we know that, of course, psychology and blah, 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 brain chemistry also matters. But, we had to make sociology a thing. And so to me, like, we can all take the high road and kind of move on. But there are people who are more interested than I am in genes. I just personally, as a sociologist, it's not the most important thing to me. They're a mechanism of reproduction, but they're only one mechanism. I don't know if that answers the question or sidesteps it.
No, that's a great comment. Thank you. I mean, it's still. I don't think it could be good. It could be answered directly. The last thing, how much further we can move with our understanding of this human being as ecosystem. So it's impossible to answer within a short answer. But yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thanks. Well, Gabe, I have to admit first, I haven't yet read your work, but after listening to this, I certainly will. And I guess that's one of the purposes of the Moscow seminar. On the one hand, you have to take everything I'm saying. It's not really about your work, since I haven't studied it. Is some response to your talk today and more generally. And I'd just like you to respond to these questions and I know you have good responses, and I'd like to know what they are. You want sociologists to take the high road in relationship to, let's say, genetic, biological brain research and discoveries, but people who do this work and make the connections often themselves take the low road. So that, as Parsons said in his introduction to the structure of social action in 1937, there's faced with the complexity and the existential anxiety and the openness of decision-making in modern societies, there's a tremendous temptation to reduce action to biology, on the one hand, and let's say metaphysics on the other. And so ever since Darwin had his influence on Spencer and going through Parsons' use of cybernetics, etc., there's been these very powerful claims that new discoveries in biology, the latest being genetics, let's say, really will force a revolutionary rethinking in social theory and social sciences. So the responses to that are very defensive and aggressive because these claims are reductive. For example, in my experience, when I was at Harvard in the late 60s as an undergraduate, there was a big, well, the main claims in those days were really about baboons and about ethology research. You mentioned butterflies, but a more relevant area is the higher mammals, and especially baboons, who are supposed to be the closest to human life and human societies. And there was a man named Robert Awdry who wrote The Territorial Imperative, and a series of books became one of the most influential science society writers of his time, arguing that private property and the defense of property were rooted in a genetic biological imperative to defend, because you see how baboons defend their own property. Or Konrad Lorenz, who was really one of the great founders of modern ethology, writing his book on aggression. And then I wrote a paper on Awdry saying, but if you look at Lorenz's theory, he in a way even imports culture into instinct theory because he developed this theory of imprinting. And he argued that even fish didn't know a lot of things, but they had to look at how their parents and other fish behaved to imprint that even their genetic structure was relatively open, that it had to be, in a way, interactionally coded to allow them to become fish. And then there's this whole argument, you mentioned 50-50 genes, et cetera, and that the evolutionary development of Homo sapiens sapiens, the key factor was that the jaw and the brain developed in a way to allow them to speak, which meant that language becomes the key issue of differentiating social from less developed forms of behavior. And because I hear your examples here as arguing the opposite in terms of look at the blood levels and the nutrition levels of people in poor neighborhoods, that makes me think that you want to jump over. You want to argue that biological or physical conditions can lead us to understand why people, for example, engage in crime. But your theoretical statements argue against those suggestions. For me, Bourdieu has a very distorted view of determinism in social relationships. So when I find that you want to let's say, underscore determinacy of habitus by seeing the genetic, cellular, electrical brain issues, this disturbs me. I think Bourdieu's wrong about habitus, that it ignores the autonomy of moral judgment and the growth of a self that has independence, a great deal of independence vis-a-vis social structure. The last 2 points I'd make are that is in a way a problem of emergentism. I'd like you to speak, because you used the word, and to me, the notion of emergent properties and the philosophy of science that talks about emergentism is critical here. I mean, let's say aesthetic perception of nature, the aesthetic experience of nature, it's impossible to have that without the brain and the body. But to develop a theory of the aesthetic perception of nature sociologically, we don't need to refer to those lower levels, but rather to the emergent level of history and society. I mean, that would be a strong emergentist position. I thought I had one other point to make. Oh yeah, the last is, if we agree that the brain or similar things, but are very significant, most researchers that I know in brain studies argue that they don't understand how the brain works at all, that this is the beginning of something that we might understand in 100 years. And like, what is even the relationship between the neuron system of the brain and, let's say, mental illness? There's absolutely no agreement about that. People can't even intervene effectively. They don't know why, for example, psychotropic drugs really work at a basic level. So I have a lot of skepticism about this. I feel that there's been a continuous effort to reduce social behavior to biological structures, and that in a way it's an escape from freedom. So I'd like you to respond to all of that. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you, Jeff. So fundamentally, I think, I mean, the MGB argument is non-reductionist, as I presented in the paper. So it's not the case that the microbiome-gut-brain axis determines anything. It's that it is a kind of intervening mechanism through which society shapes the person. So through nutrition, through lifestyle, through experience, but that all those experiences are translated into our bodies, our brains, our guts, our microbiome works. And then, so I sense a kind of defensiveness and then the sort of history of the social sciences relationships with the natural sciences and primatology and E.O. Wilson and all of this. And I think it's hard to get past that, I suppose. But I think for those of us who don't have to kind of carry the flag for sociology or for the social sciences, where if you're free to kind of explore and maybe get past that defensiveness, I mean, there's so much there that we can use to improve our sociological models. And it just points to empirical relationships that we wouldn't otherwise know to look for, like the relationship between food deserts and crime or learning or relationships or things like that, or between mental health and those same factors. So, I mean, that's why, at the advice of one of my, a friend of mine, sociologist, kind of biological sociologist who read an early draft of this, I open with the whole epigenetics discussion and that shift in the life sciences. It's exactly to try to get past, this history of people trying to colonize the life sciences or colonize the social sciences from the life sciences, or eliminate sociological explanation and replace it with genetic determinism or some kind of evolutionary determinism from a primatological perspective. And what I'm trying to do is get past all that and say, take the optimistic point of view, which has some support in the literature, that they're not doing this anymore over there. And I think if you do, I mean, at least in my experience, if you talk to biologists I mean, they're not necessarily people who spend a lot of time thinking about politics and culture and history, but the ones I interact with aren't aggressively, well, most of them are not aggressively, kind of dead set against social science explanation or higher level explanation, or I don't think they're interested in, reducing free will, or eliminating free will from their models of human behavior. So I think it's possible. I think the high road does involve interacting with these disciplines as equals and looking to where they can help us point to empirical relationships that can make our research better, give us more explanatory power. I just think it's something we have to get past. But there will always be I suppose there will always be institutional pressures for different academic disciplines to define themselves in opposition to each other as they compete for resources and status. But insofar as we can get past that, or some of us can do research that ignores those, insofar as it's possible, ignores those boundaries, and if we reach across the aisle and work with life scientists on research, I think it makes us better sociologists. I don't think it threatens sociology. In fact, I think the opposite is true, that if we don't do this, if we don't engage in this kind of interdisciplinary research, we wall ourselves off and we kind of slowly lose relevance, as other people from other disciplines will do this research anyway, but they'll do it less well because they don't have us to help. So I think we should engage, and I think there's plenty of opportunity to do so, and it'll benefit sociology if we do so. I don't know if that's
okay. Thanks.
Overly optimistic or naive.
Yeah, thank you. Another question from the room.
Thank you. I have two comments. One of them is more about the kind of the structure of your talk, or the structure of your argument. What I found kind of most difficult for me to kind of grasp was the sort of jump you make from this kind of a smaller argument and the bigger argument you make. And by smaller argument, I mean the idea that we need to kind of widen our understanding of what the human being is, also through kind of addressing these microbiome-gut-brain axis. So we kind of have to widen our understanding of the cognition, also through widening the understanding of what nervous system is. We need to consider like the neurotransmitters and the way that kind of this our neurosystems and kind of hormones, and also all the stuff is related to our emotions, and to not only our emotions, but also kind of a relationship between people, like oxytocin, right? Kind of changes the way we relate to others. Very kind of we can easily register kind of that influence. But the bigger argument that you make is the one that about this multidisciplinary science that we kind of have to become. And that kind of jump between the one and the two is something which is the hardest thing for me to understand. How do you make that claim? Because the bigger argument seems to be that we have to kind of, as sociology, as a kind of a discipline, we have to change ourselves completely. So kind of change our also kind of fundamental epistemological premises and so on. So yeah, that is something which is not so clear to me. And like, are you actually offering that we suggesting that we have to change the discipline completely, or not? Because even the argument of kind of that that we have to work together with the kind of cutting edge life sciences and neurosciences and so on, is not the same as saying that sociology has to change and like there is this low road and high road and we have to take the high road. And another comment is more about what ideas came to my mind in this what we can study and how actually the understanding of the microbiome gut axis changes the way like we think about social behavior as cultural sociologists, for example. So let's say we establish that these neurotransmitters influence the way people behave and communicate between each other and the way kind of the social connections work. And then we start talking about how like modern societies, Western modern societies mostly suffer from, people suffer from depressions and anxieties. So we are talking about major changes in the way people kind of interact between themselves and form connections and so on, because they are very anxious or because they're very depressed. So they kind of their ability to form connections and bonds and to solidarize, in a sense, like to extend the argument even further, become limited. And so kind of the effect of our kind of psychological, collective psychological state and the way it is all connected with neurotransmitters kind of directly affect the way our social connections work. And if we also think like depression and anxiety, but mostly depression or like the lack of serotonin is related to ability to experience emotions kind of vividly and strongly and so on. And then we remember that one of the important social kind of key elements of the way that solidarity is established is effervescence. And this is an emotional experience. So people have to be able to experience this strong collective emotion. And if you kind of lack serotonin, then you become like biologically limited in being able to experience that, to experience this feeling, this kind of collective unity and like belonging to a something bigger, which is something bigger than yourself, and kind of this transcending experiences and so on. So that can actually make us, that makes me think that this neuroendocrinology and neurotransmitters and so on, this kind of adding this level of understanding to our research can actually, make us think about like bigger problems to come in sociology, like in sociological terms and in cultural sociology in particular. So that's just my question and the comment.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I don't think I have any programmatic claims for how sociology as a whole should change. I know people do that. I don't think anyone's going to listen to me. How I think the whole field should change, or how we should alter our epistemology. I mean, I think there are, for those small number, that minority of sociologists who might be interested in engaging with some of this research, I mean, I think it does entail a certain kind of realist epistemology, like that we're looking at real mechanisms, they're really there, and we can study them using the available scientific methods. But that's not really the thrust of the paper. It's sort of at the end, there's a note about that. But I mean, to me, all of this, it supplements sociology and it integrates within sociology. I mean, as you brought up, we discussed Bourdieu, and now you brought up Durkheim and collective effervescence. I mean, nothing in the MGB kind of, my integration of all that into sociology fundamentally challenges Durkheim. I think it fits, as you suggest, right into Durkheim, just specifies, it specifies the potentially collective effervescence, and other people are doing this research, by the way, on the kind of physiology of religious experience. So it's being done in sociology and other fields, especially psychology, but it just tells us more about the mechanisms by which collective effervescence occurs, rather than leaving it kind of vague, like it's a kind of magical or it occurs through certain social situations only. Well, it does occur through social situations only, but there are other factors, as you mentioned. I mean, if you're sort of nutritionally depleted, then maybe you can't, you don't have sufficient serotonin and what have you, and then so you're not going to experience collective effervescence the way other people are. So, yeah, I think it supplements and it integrates with, a lot of classical sociology, sociological theory, standard sociological methods, and it just adds to the toolkit, as I specify in the paper, some different avenues we can take. Whether sociology as a whole, I don't think there's any chance that most sociological researchers are going to be interested in this, in integrating research from biology and related areas into their research. It's more that I just want to make a little bit of space for people who might want to do that, and just give them some resources, and maybe clear some of the the sort of PTSD, the sort of trauma we've all experienced from interacting with other disciplines where we feel we're under assault. And I don't think that the threats are what we think they are, and I think it's also paralyzing in some sense. If we think we always have to defend ourselves, then we miss out on the opportunity to do sociology better, do social science better, just be better researchers and understand the world, because we're trying to defend some boundaries. But yeah, I mean, the epistemological implications of this, I mean, other people have written about that. I mean, Dimitri and I discussed some of the critical realist literature, so that I'm not going to, I don't think it's necessary in this venue to go into critical realism and all of that, all of those epistemological and ontological debates too much. I mean, we can discuss that if you like, but I think these are more tools for our toolbox, and it by and large fits into sociological theory, at least some of the sociology that has lasted, that we still value. I mean, it fits in. That's the point, I guess. That there's a deep compatibility here, not an antagonism, not necessarily. I feel like maybe I'm an optimistic person and like, again, just naive or something, but I just think we can, I think this is where things are going to go anyway, and they're already going that direction. So let's go ahead and move in that direction.
Okay. Thank you. I think we had a question from Andrea, but she had to go, and maybe somebody else have questions, comments. Okay, Alica.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. And thank you for the wonderful lecture and also the discussion. I very much enjoyed it. And I also enjoy reading the paper. And it gave me a lot of food for thought, I have to say. For me, it's very hard to understand all of this without tackling this old and still ongoing debate about the relevance of sociology in this world. Because what is missing to me from this discussion is that the fact that we are living in kind of cultural hegemony of quantifiable models and life science as such, right? Clear causality and predictions and empiricism. And I very much like the idea of the compatibility between the life science and sociology. But I was just wondering if sociology is not weakening itself, because the fact that we are so defensive about our discipline and we are justifying it in every occasion. I'm teaching first-year students, so I know what does it mean to really justify the relevance of sociological thinking in this kind of world. I think that this fact is pretty much related to this cultural hegemony that we are living in. And I was thinking, as I was reading the paper and I was listening to this discussion and to this wonderful lecture, if this is not about, or maybe I'm not understanding the argument in a thorough way, but is your argument that the culture and cultural environment and social structure should be taken into account, or it seems to me that this is what you are saying as another kind of variable with which we can explain better the nature of human beings and the behavior. And I really feel this strong emphasis on the explanation and not so much on interpretation, which I personally perceive as a task of cultural sociology. And I was thinking to what extent life sciences, natural sciences, biology, neurobiology, and all of this is compatible with these more interpretive dimensions of sociology and cultural sociology in particular. This more reflexive kind of thinking, not so much explanatory, but more interpretative. If that's understandable what I'm talking about. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That will take a few hours, I think, for me to answer. I mean, is interpretive humanistic sociology compatible with, life science research? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if they share fundamental epistemology. I guess I don't see researchers in that area doing interdisciplinary research this way. I mean, I do think that there is a compatibility between empirical, quantitative and empirical sociology, but I think no, that's actually not true. I mean, you can do interpretive sociology or qualitative sociology, ethnographic research and interview research and so on. I think if you assume that what you're studying is some kind of reality, and that you're trying to model that reality as best you can using the available methods, and understanding that reality is not, you'll never come to a conclusive model, but you're trying to approximate it using qualitative, quantitative, etc. Whatever methods all the tools we have in our toolbox. And I think that research from other fields, including the life sciences, should be tools in that toolbox. So I don't see an incompatibility. I think there's maybe just a difference in skills and backgrounds and training between people who are interested in more interpretive and humanistic sociology, and then people who might reach out to and be interested in the life sciences or computational fields. But I don't think there's a fundamental incompatibility. Maybe a difference in style more than anything. That's the short answer. I don't know if that is adequate.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's something that I will be thinking about, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions or comments? I think we're reaching to an end. Oh, Dmitry.
I mean, I have as long as nobody else wanted to ask serious questions, I have kind of probably a hooligan question based on what you said about how you commented on Jeff's lecture and his theory of wilderness and cultural construction of nature. Because what he said is that, okay, if we believe that coming to the forest, what makes us positive affect is those trees per se, those probably smell as is, and probably this visual, picture as is without being unmediated by culture, it is a reductionism. But also, if we only think that we only get some benefit out of it because we deeply believe it is pleasurable and useful and gives us a lot of and valuable, it is also a kind of reductionism, a kind of cultural or social reductionism. And in fact, we have to see those as an emergent effect of combination of those. So if that is true, and it seems to be, I think it's plausible, if that's true, then probably they are deeply wrong in evidence-based medicine with those experiments, placebo experiments, because when we have a real pill, the experimental group, those who are getting a real pill, we are probably experiencing combination of the chemical effect of the pill and our deep belief in, rational order of the universe, and they actually affect us in combination, and cannot, those placebo effect and full effect cannot be separated. Is it true?
Absolutely. I don't think. You can't turn off your interpretive, like your neocortex, like your interpretive apparatus. You can't. There is no direct experience. So this gets to the dual process model. I think you know that. You can't turn off your interpretation. This is where the dual process model is wrong. Like, you don't directly perceive things and then interpret them. That's the dual process model. One comes first, type 1, and then type 2. That's not true. I go through that. You go through some of the limitations, the faults of this kind of information processing computer model as applied to people. Like, we're just interpreting the data, or we get the data, raw data, and then we interpret it. That doesn't seem to be the case based on everything I've read. And I share some of that research in the Sociological Forum article. What we do is we interpret everything all the time in waves, sort of waves of basically course-to-fine interpretation. So I see something over there, dangerous. Then I see something, oh, okay, it's this big. Oh, then I see it's a bear running at me. And then all that in milliseconds. But there's everything is being interpreted. Like, you can't separate. The brain is not so. The dual process model is premised on a kind of hypermodular view of the brain. Like, the brain has these different sections, and they turn on one at a time. And that is not the case. That's not how it works at a neuroanatomical level whatsoever. All the different parts of the brain are, they're innervated with each other highly, including the kind of primitive parts of the brain that they like to discuss in the context of type 1 cognition. It is connected to the neocortex, to the visual cortex, with millions and billions of nerve cells. So that model is wrong. Everything gets interpreted. So everything is filtered through culture. There's no raw experience. At the same time, as you mentioned, it's not just culture, or it's not just some kind of disembodied culture or interpretations. Everything is tied together. So, I think the high road is to move on, move past that. That's the kind of a scholastic fallacy of this is how we set up our academic disciplines. So let's make reality fit, the academy, the structure, the institutional structure of the academy, and our identities as they are based on that structure. And that's, as Jeff's kind of suggested, there are all these forces that make that so, and make it difficult to break out of that. But at least for those of us, some of us are free to, we can kind of do what we want. So, why shouldn't we? Or at least if we're going to do what we want, just leave us alone. Don't get in the way. But, we don't have to. I think I'm 100% with you. And I think most people understand that intuitively. There is no raw experience without culture. You don't go into the woods and it just happens to you. Like, the magic just happens no matter who you are. Of course, it depends on what you've learned, on what you've read, on the music you listen to, on your beliefs, your religion, your philosophy.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we are over, does anybody want to ask something?
Do we have questions from YouTube? Oh, sorry, Adam has a question.
Sorry, I have some laryngitis. I don't have a question per se, but I just want to comment to say thank you, because I work as someone who rates Bourdieu and who works on sociology of sport. I know the sociology of, but I see a lot of potential for this in my work. I'm still working through it. This is all very new to me. So I'm working through the implications of it, but I find it very interesting. And I just wanted to say thank you.
I don't know. Thank you. I feel like my whole career I've been writing. I basically write for grad students and for people in the future. Well, at some point, maybe they'll go for some of this. But Yeah, that's cool. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this session. I think it's great. And if, yeah, we can share the recording, I think. Are you okay with that?
Of course, of course. Is it?
Yes.
Will this be on YouTube? I assume it'll be posted
Yes,
on YouTube.
it will be on YouTube, and it will be either we can make it available to everyone, or we can make it available via link, which is better.
Make it open. I mean,
Okay.
I don't think there'll be very much advertising revenue, but
Okay.
it can be publicly available.
Okay. Thank you then.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dimitri and
Bye.
Jason and everyone.
Thank you.
Tamara, I appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.